The winter of 1944 was closing in on Europe like a noose. Across the frozen fields of France and Germany, exhausted soldiers from both sides of the conflict dreamed of an end that seemed eternally distant. But in the command bunkers of the Third Reich, a different kind of exhaustion had taken root, one that had nothing to do with bullets or artillery shells. It was psychological, it was primal, and it had a name: George Smith Patton, Jr. To understand what truly terrified German commanders about Patton, we must first dismantle the mythology that surrounds him. Popular culture has painted him as a brash cowboy general, all ivory-handle pistols and profanity-laced speeches. But this superficial portrait misses the essence of what made Patton genuinely dangerous. The Germans didn't fear him because he was loud. They feared him because he understood warfare at a level that bordered on the supernatural, a synthesis of classical military theory, modern mechanized doctrine, and an almost pathological refusal to accept the limitations that constrained other commanders. Patton's battlefield philosophy was deceptively simple: speed kills hesitation, and hesitation kills armies. But this simplicity concealed layers of strategic sophistication that the Wehrmacht's officer corps, trained in the methodical traditions of Prussian military academies, found deeply unsettling. While German commanders calculated logistics, supply lines, and acceptable casualty rates, Patton operated on instinct sharpened by decades of obsessive study. He had read Caesar's commentaries in the original Latin. He had internalized Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. He believed, genuinely believed, that he had fought in previous lives, at Cannae, at Crécy, at Waterloo. Whether this was delusion or genius became irrelevant when his tanks started moving. The psychological warfare began long before Patton's Third Army ever crossed the German border. In the months following D-Day, German intelligence became fixated on tracking his movements. Reports flooded into Wehrmacht headquarters. Patton had been spotted in Dover. No, he was in Kent. Radio intercepts suggested a massive army group under his command, positioned perfectly to launch a devastating assault on the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route to Germany's industrial heartland. Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, redeployed entire divisions to counter this phantom threat. But Patton wasn't in Dover or Kent. He was commanding the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, FUSAC, an elaborate deception involving inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and carefully orchestrated public appearances. This wasn't Patton's own operation. He was merely the centerpiece of a broader Allied stratagem. Yet his selection for this role revealed something critical. The Germans considered him dangerous enough that his mere presence could reshape their strategic calculus. Even when he was doing nothing, he occupied their minds. Even when silent, he spoke volumes through their fear. The deception worked because it exploited a fundamental truth that German commanders had learned the hard way. When Patton attacked, he didn't just defeat armies, he disintegrated them. His campaigns in Sicily and North Africa had demonstrated an unsettling pattern. While other Allied generals ground forward through methodical set-piece battles, Patton's forces seemed to appear behind enemy lines like apparitions, severing communications, capturing headquarters, creating chaos that spread faster than any tactical response could contain it. What made this particularly terrifying for German officers was that it violated their understanding of how modern warfare should function. The Wehrmacht had pioneered Blitzkrieg, lightning war, built on principles of speed, shock, and concentrated armored assault. They had used these tactics to conquer Poland in weeks, France in 6 weeks, and vast stretches of the Soviet Union in months. They understood mechanized warfare at a fundamental level. They had written the doctrine. But Patton had read their doctrine, absorbed it, refined it, and was now wielding it against them with a ferocity and unpredictability that made their own past victories seem cautious by comparison. German commanders preparing defensive positions in late 1944 faced an impossible calculation. Traditional military theory suggested that defenders held inherent advantages: fortified positions, prepared fields of fire, mined approaches, concentrated artillery support. A competent attacking force might advance at a rate of a few miles per day against such defenses, giving defenders time to regroup, counterattack, and establish new lines. But Patton's Third Army had demonstrated in France that it could advance 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles in a single day, not through open terrain, but through contested ground, against an enemy that was supposed to be fighting back. This created a psychological crisis within the Wehrmacht's command structure. How do you defend against an enemy who moves faster than your capacity to respond? How do you establish a defensive line when that line might be rendered irrelevant within hours? The traditional solutions, counterattacks, mobile reserves, strategic withdrawals to more defensible positions, all assumed a tempo of warfare that Patton simply refused to accept. He attacked constantly, simultaneously, from unexpected directions.
When his tanks ran low on fuel, he complained bitterly to Eisenhower and Bradley, but his columns kept moving anyway, scavenging supplies, living off captured German depots, maintaining momentum through sheer aggressive willpower. By December 1944, as the German military prepared its desperate gamble in the Ardennes, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's reputation had metastasized into something beyond respect or even fear. It had become mythological. German soldiers whispered that Patton could sense weakness in defensive lines, that his tanks appeared where they shouldn't be able to go, that his Third Army didn't need supply lines because it consumed the enemy's resources as it advanced. These weren't entirely superstitions. They were pattern recognition, shaped by brutal experience.
What the German commanders feared wasn't supernatural. It was something far more tangible, and therefore far more terrifying. A command philosophy that treated time itself as a weapon. While the Wehrmacht's generals conducted warfare like chess masters, calculating moves and countermoves within established parameters, Patton played an entirely different game. He didn't seek to outmaneuver his opponents within the existing rules of engagement. He sought to operate at a tempo so violent, so relentless, that the rules themselves became irrelevant. The mechanics of this approach were brutally elegant. Traditional military doctrine in World War II emphasized the operational pause, periodic stops in offensive operations to consolidate gains, re-establish supply lines, rest exhausted troops, and prepare for the next phase. These pauses were considered not just prudent, but essential. Armies that outran their logistics invariably faced catastrophic breakdowns. History was littered with cautionary tales. Napoleon's advance into Russia, the German drive toward Moscow in 1941, countless examples of overextension leading to disaster. Patton understood this history. He had studied it obsessively, but he had also identified something that more cautious commanders missed. The operational pause benefited the defender even more than it benefited the attacker. Every hour that an advancing army stopped to consolidate was an hour the enemy used to reorganize shattered units, establish new defensive positions, move reserves into blocking positions, and most critically, recover psychologically from the shock of defeat. The pause transformed warfare from a continuous psychological assault into a series of discrete battles, each one allowing the defender to reset mentally and prepare for the next engagement. Patton's solution was radical: eliminate the pause entirely. His Third Army would attack continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until the enemy completely collapsed. Units that became exhausted would be rotated out, while fresh units maintained the advance. Supply problems would be solved through aggressive improvisation, capturing enemy fuel depots, requisitioning civilian vehicles, even stripping resources from slower-moving Allied units. The advance would never stop, the pressure would never relent, the enemy would never be given time to breathe. For German commanders trained in methodical Prussian military tradition, this approach seemed suicidal. Their initial response was to wait for Patton's inevitable logistical collapse, the moment when his overextended columns would grind to a halt, vulnerable and isolated, ripe for devastating counterattacks. But that collapse never came. Or rather, it came and went in hours instead of days, as Patton's logistics officers performed what seemed like mathematical impossibilities, moving millions of gallons of fuel, thousands of tons of ammunition, and essential supplies across hundreds of miles of damaged infrastructure to units that refused to stop moving long enough to be properly resupplied. The psychological impact of this continuous offensive was devastating in ways that transcend mere military defeat. German units facing Patton's Third Army found themselves in a perpetual state of crisis. There was no time to dig proper defensive positions before American tanks appeared. Artillery batteries barely finished setting up before they had to displace to avoid being overrun. Command posts established in supposedly secure rear areas discovered American armored columns cutting their communications within hours. Unit cohesion, the fundamental glue that holds military formations together under stress, began to disintegrate not because of casualties, but because of confusion and exhaustion. Wehrmacht after-action reports from this period reveal a fascinating pattern. German commanders didn't describe being defeated by Patton's forces in conventional military terms. They described being overwhelmed, bypassed, isolated, and most tellingly, disoriented. These are not the words of soldiers who fought a battle and lost. These are the words of soldiers who found themselves trapped in a situation where the normal logic of warfare had ceased to function. They knew their defensive positions were strong. They knew their artillery was properly registered. They knew their infantry was confident and their officers experienced. But none of it mattered, because the battle they had prepared for never arrived. Instead, American armored columns appeared in their rear areas,
their supply lines evaporated, and they found themselves fighting in 6 directions simultaneously against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. This was Patton's true genius, and what genuinely terrified German commanders. He had weaponized chaos itself. Traditional military theory seeks to reduce chaos, to impose order on the battlefield through planning, coordination, and systematic execution. Patton inverted this entirely. He deliberately created chaos, then exploited his own superior capacity to operate within that chaos to destroy enemies who were still trying to fight an orderly battle. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated this principle with devastating clarity. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes in December 1944, they caught the Allied command structure completely off guard. The attack shattered American defensive lines, surrounded entire divisions, and created a massive bulge in the Allied front, hence the name. Eisenhower called an emergency conference of his senior commanders at Verdun on December 19th. The mood was grim. The Germans had achieved complete tactical surprise and were driving deep into Allied-held territory. This required a coordinated counterattack, but such operations typically took weeks to plan and execute. Patton arrived at this conference and told Eisenhower he could attack north into the German flank in 48 hours. The room fell silent. What Patton proposed was theoretically impossible. His Third Army was currently engaged in offensive operations driving east toward Germany. To attack north into the Bulge would require disengaging from that offensive, wheeling 3 entire divisions 90 degrees, moving them over 100 miles through winter conditions on inadequate roads, coordinating with units from other armies that used different radio frequencies and command procedures, and launching a full-scale assault, all within 2 days. Other commanders in the room thought Patton was grandstanding, making impossible promises to enhance his reputation. But those who had fought along him knew better. They had seen him do impossible things before. The Germans, monitoring Allied communications and assessing probable response times, calculated that any significant American counterattack into their southern flank couldn't arrive for at least 10 days, time enough to reach their objectives and consolidate. Patton attacked in 72 hours. Not 48, weather delayed him slightly, but 3 days instead of the 10 the Germans expected. 3 entire divisions, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, all wheeling north through ice and snow and attacking with such ferocity that German commanders initially thought they were facing a much smaller spoiling attack rather than a full corps-level offensive.
The relief of Bastogne wasn't merely a tactical victory. It was a psychological detonation that reverberated through every level of the German command structure. For Wehrmacht officers who had spent years calculating probabilities, assessing Allied capabilities, and developing defensive strategies based on rational assumptions about what their enemies could and couldn't do, Patton's arrival shattered fundamental assumptions. It wasn't just that he had moved faster than expected. It was that he had moved faster than what German staff officers, using the same logistical calculations and terrain analysis that had served them throughout the war, had determined was physically possible. This cognitive dissonance created something more dangerous than fear. It created doubt. Military organizations function on predictability. Commanders make decisions based on intelligence assessments about enemy capabilities and probable courses of action. When those assessments prove accurate, confidence builds. When they prove wrong, adjustments are made. But when they prove catastrophically, impossibly wrong, the entire decision-making apparatus begins to malfunction. German officers planning defensive operations in early 1945 faced an impossible dilemma. Do we plan for what Patton should be able to do, or what he has demonstrated he can do? The former made logistical sense, but had repeatedly proven inadequate. The latter seemed to require defending against an omnipresent threat that could appear anywhere, at any time, with overwhelming force. Patton understood this psychological dimension instinctively. His infamous temper, his theatrical persona, his carefully cultivated image as an unstable warrior poet, these weren't character flaws that happened to coexist with military brilliance. They were integral components of a comprehensive approach to warfare that treated enemy morale as a legitimate military target. Every profanity-laced speech that leaked to the press, every public confrontation with superiors, every story of him leading from the front in his custom-decorated tank contributed to a larger-than-life image that occupied German minds as effectively as his actual divisions occupied territory. The Germans had their own term for this phenomenon, Patton psychosis, Patton psychosis. It appeared in intelligence reports and intercepted communications with increasing frequency as 1945 progressed. German commanders became fixated on his location, his intentions, his next move. Entire divisions were held in reserve not to count actual threats, but to respond to potential Patton offensives. Defensive lines were overbuilt in sectors where his appearance seemed likely. Resources were diverted from other fronts to reinforce positions that Patton might attack. This represented a fundamental strategic victory that transcended conventional military metrics. Patton had transformed himself into a force multiplier, not through superior numbers or firepower, but through the enemy's own fear. German divisions immobilized by the mere possibility of facing Third Army were divisions that couldn't be deployed against other Allied forces. German fuel and ammunition stockpiled in defensive positions that Patton never attacked were resources unavailable elsewhere. The Wehrmacht was shadowboxing against an opponent who had managed to be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, forcing them to defend everything while concentrating nowhere. But the most terrifying aspect of Patton's approach, from the German perspective, wasn't his speed or his aggression, or even his psychological warfare. It was his apparent capacity to think like they thought, to anticipate their responses before they made them. Time and again, German commanders attempting to establish defensive positions found that Patton had already identified and exploited the weaknesses in those positions before they were fully occupied. Counterattacks launched against his flanks discovered that he had positioned reserves exactly where they would be most effective. Attempts to cut his supply lines failed because he had already rerouted logistics through alternate channels. This wasn't supernatural prescience. It was the product of obsessive intelligence work combined with an intuitive understanding of operational warfare that came from decades of study. Patton's intelligence section was arguably the most efficient in the entire Allied command structure, not because they had better sources or more sophisticated analysis tools, but because Patton actually read their reports, internalized them, and incorporated them into his decision-making process in real time. While other commanders received intelligence briefings as part of their morning routine, Patton consumed intelligence continuously, updating his mental model of the battlefield with every new piece of information. He also understood something about the German military mindset that many Allied commanders missed. The Wehrmacht, for all its tactical prowess and operational flexibility, was fundamentally a hierarchical organization bound by doctrine and protocol. German officers were trained to operate within established frameworks, to follow procedures that had been refined over centuries of Prussian military tradition. This created patterns, predictable patterns, in how they responded to different tactical situations. Patton studied these patterns obsessively, not to fight predictably against them, but to violate them in ways that would create maximum confusion. When German doctrine dictated withdrawal to prepared secondary positions, Patton attacked those positions before they could be fully occupied. When doctrine suggested counterattacking exposed flanks, he positioned his reserves to ambush those counterattacks. When doctrine recommended establishing strong points to channel enemy advances, he simply bypassed them, leaving isolated German garrisons surrounded and irrelevant while his armor continued east. He fought a fundamentally asymmetric war against an enemy that kept trying to fight symmetrically, and the asymmetry was psychological as much as tactical. By March 1945, as Third Army approached the Rhine, the final natural barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland, the psychological collapse of Wehrmacht resistance in Patton's sector had become evident even to outside observers. German units that fought with suicidal determination against other Allied forces surrendered en masse to Third Army. Officers who might have organized desperate last stands instead withdrew without authorization, prioritizing survival over duty. The famous Prussian military discipline, which had sustained German armies through catastrophic reversals for centuries, was disintegrating specifically in sectors where Patton operated. The Rhine crossing itself became the culminating demonstration of everything that terrified German commanders about Patton. Military theory suggested that crossing a major river against determined opposition required extensive preparation, weeks of reconnaissance, engineering preparations, artillery bombardment, and coordinated assault boats. The Rhine was nearly 1,000 feet wide in places, with swift currents and heavily fortified eastern banks. Every bridge had been demolished. German forces on the far side had weeks to prepare defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire covering every possible crossing point. Patton crossed in 48 hours with minimal casualties, using whatever boats his engineers could scrounge, improvise, or capture. He didn't wait for elaborate preparations because waiting allowed the Germans to strengthen their defenses. He didn't conduct extensive reconnaissance because he understood that speed and surprise were more valuable than perfect information. And perhaps most characteristically, he didn't inform his superiors that he was crossing until his forces were already established on the far side, calling Eisenhower's chief of staff to announce, "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across. I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." This last detail reveals something crucial about Patton's psychology that German commanders perhaps understood better than his own allies. He wasn't just fighting the Wehrmacht, he was fighting for legacy, for recognition, for vindication of his approach to warfare against critics who considered him reckless and insubordinate. This made him more dangerous, not less, because it meant he would take risks and push advances that more cautious commanders would avoid. The final weeks of the Third Reich revealed the ultimate consequence of what Patton had done to the German military psyche. As Allied forces converged on Germany from all directions, Wehrmacht commanders faced an unprecedented crisis, not merely of resources or manpower, but of comprehension itself. They could no longer reliably assess what was possible. The fundamental mathematical certainties that had governed military planning for centuries, calculations of distance, time, supply capacity, and force concentration, had been rendered obsolete by an opponent who seemed to operate outside those constraints entirely. In the closing days of March and throughout April 1945, Third Army advanced through Germany at speeds that defied contemporary military doctrine. Patton's columns covered distances in single days that would have represented successful week-long campaigns by previous standards. Towns that German commanders expected to defend for days fell in hours. Defensive lines carefully prepared over weeks were penetrated and bypassed before they could effectively engage. The Wehrmacht's command structure didn't just collapse, it fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance, each one unable to coordinate with others, unable to establish coherent defensive lines, unable to do anything except delay the inevitable by hours or days. What made this collapse particularly devastating was its psychological character. These weren't poorly trained conscripts or demoralized garrison troops. Many units facing Third Army included veterans of the Eastern Front, soldiers who had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and the brutal, grinding warfare of the Soviet advance. They understood combat at its most savage. They had faced enemies as ruthless and determined as any in military history. But the Eastern Front, for all its horrors, had maintained a certain operational logic. Territory was traded for time, defensive positions could be established and held, counterattacks, when properly resourced, could succeed. The war in the East was brutal and desperate, but it was comprehensible. Patton's advance through Germany was incomprehensible. German commanders issuing orders discovered those orders were obsolete before they could be executed. Units moving to defensive positions found American armor already occupying those positions. Communications networks carefully established were severed before they could transmit critical intelligence. The Wehrmacht had spent years learning to fight a war of maneuver and strategic depth. Patton showed them what maneuver actually meant when practiced without restraint, without caution, without the operational pauses that allowed defenders to reorient. The intelligence reports filtering back to what remained of German high command paint a picture of institutional bewilderment. Phrases appear repeatedly: American advance inexplicable in speed, enemy forces appeared in sector without warning, defensive preparations incomplete when assault commenced. These weren't excuses manufactured to justify defeat. They were accurate descriptions of a phenomenon that violated established understanding of what mechanized warfare could accomplish. The Germans had invented blitzkrieg, had used it to conquer most of Europe, had refined it through years of continuous combat. Patton had taken their innovation and weaponized it against them with an intensity and ruthlessness that made their own past offensive seem restrained. By mid-April, German commanders in Third Army sector faced a grim reality. Resistance was militarily futile. They lacked the resources to stop Patton's advance. They lacked the time to organize effective counterattacks. They lacked the communications infrastructure to coordinate what few forces remained. But more fundamentally, they lacked the psychological capacity to continue believing that resistance might succeed. Patton hadn't just defeated them tactically, he had defeated their confidence in their own military judgment. Officers who had spent careers mastering the operational art discovered that mastery meant nothing against an opponent who rewrote the rules through sheer aggressive willpower. The final proof of Patton's psychological dominance came not in battle but in surrender. German units throughout his sector began capitulating en masse, often without firing a shot. Officers who might have organized suicidal last stands instead negotiated terms. Soldiers who had sworn oaths to fight to the death instead laid down their weapons and waited for American columns to process them as prisoners. This wasn't cowardice. Many of these same soldiers had demonstrated extraordinary courage on other fronts. It was rational calculation by men who had concluded that resistance against Third Army specifically was pointless. This selective demoralization, this focused collapse of will to resist specifically in Patton's sector, represents perhaps the clearest evidence of what he had accomplished. The Wehrmacht didn't lose faith in German victory. That faith had been eroding since Stalingrad. They didn't lose faith in their own military competence. They remained formidable opponents against other Allied forces right up to the final days. What they lost, specifically and deliberately, was faith in their capacity to effectively oppose George S. Patton. The ironic irony is that Patton achieved this psychological domination while frequently being undersupplied, undersupported, and underappreciated by his own command structure. Eisenhower and Bradley, his superiors, regularly constrained his operations, diverted his fuel to other armies, and prevented him from advancing as far
far and as fast as he wanted. Patton spent as much energy fighting his own commanders for resources as he spent fighting Germans. Yet even operating under these constraints, even with one hand tied behind his back by cautious superiors worried about his recklessness, he so thoroughly dominated the psychological landscape of the Western Front that German commanders feared him above all other Allied generals. In the final analysis, what terrified German commanders about Patton wasn't his tactical brilliance, or his operational innovations, or his aggressive personality. It was something more primal, the realization that they were facing an opponent who understood war at a deeper level than they did. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on military excellence, on systematic doctrine, on the accumulated wisdom of Prussian military tradition. Patton had studied that tradition, absorbed it, and demonstrated that he could wield it more effectively than its own practitioners. He had beaten them at their own game while simultaneously inventing new rules they couldn't counter. The German officers who survived the war carried this knowledge forward. In post-war analyses, memoirs, and strategic studies, they returned again and again to Patton as a unique phenomenon. Not the most powerful Allied commander, that was Eisenhower. Not the most careful, that was Montgomery. Not the most politically astute, that was Bradley. But the most dangerous, the one who, had he been given free rein, might have ended the war months earlier. The one who understood that warfare at the highest level is psychological before it is physical, that destroying the enemy's will to fight is more important than destroying his capacity to fight. What Patton really did that terrified German commanders was simple and profound. He made them doubt themselves. He made experienced, competent officers question their own professional judgment. He made rational calculations of military possibilities seem inadequate. He made the carefully structured certainties of military doctrine appear obsolete. And he did this not through overwhelming force or superior resources, but through an approach to warfare that treated speed, aggression, and relentless psychological pressure as weapons more devastating than any artillery barrage. In the end, Patton proved that the greatest terror a military commander can inflict on his opponents isn't the fear of death or defeat. Soldiers accept those as professional hazards. It's the fear that everything you know, everything you've been trained to do, everything you believe about how war works might be fundamentally wrong. That fear, once planted, grows like a cancer through a military organization, eroding confidence, paralyzing decision-making, and ultimately collapsing resistance from within. That was Patton's true genius. That was what terrified them. Not the man, but the void he revealed in their understanding. Not his tactics, but the realization that he was fighting a different war than they had prepared for. And by the time they understood this, it was far too late